So first of all, when we talk about this idea of implicit bias, what we must recognize is that implicit bias serves its purpose. It serves a purpose. And we have to be clear about what purposes our implicit biases are serving and if they're effective for us or not. So even before we start talking about implicit bias, I really want to talk about how the brain works and the importance of having conversations about our brain. And the two pieces of the brain that I want to spend some time talking about is both the prefrontal cortex, which is the big part of the brain, and the smaller part of the brain, which we will call the reptilian brain, or the limbic brain, if you will. And so what we know about the limbic brain is that is, why in layman's terms it's typically called the reptilian brain. That part of the brain was the first to develop. And so our early ancestors used that smaller part of the brain, which sits at the base of the spinal cord, and that is the part of the brain that our ancestors used for basic survival. Right? Now, I don't know if you've been around babies and I mean infants, as they're being born. There are very few things that infants know, but they do know some things. For example, they know how to suckle, right? They know how to cry, they know how to defecate, and all of these things come from that primal brain source. And so when we talk about implicit bias, what we have to recognize is that the primal brain operates with one primary goal in mind: determining if things are dangerous or if they are safe for us. And so the primal brain operates off of very basic evolutionary or instinctual thought patterns, right? So basic needs that are being met. So are things safe? Is it a safe environment? Is this food safe? Am I getting my creature comforts met? Is it time to mate, right? So these are all things that are in that primal brain, that animal instinctive part of our brain. And it serves some very important functions, right? Just basic survival comes from out of this brain. Now, what I'd like for you to do is to walk with me through this story, right? So our ancient ancestors, before we lived in big communities and cities, we were hunter-gatherers, and I would suggest we were probably more gathering than we were hunting, but we were hunter-gatherers, and there's a certain way that those hunter-gatherers had to operate in the world. And it became very important that they recognized danger very quickly, right? And so what we know about those ancient ancestors is that they weren't great predators alone. That the human being's nails aren't fit for attacking prey. That we don't have any shells or scales to defend ourselves. That our hair is pretty weak as a protector. And so when we were in that environment, it became very important for us to use something that other animals in that environment, other beings in that environment didn't have. One was an opposable thumb, and the second was a big brain. Now, as we're looking at implicit bias in those ancient ancestors, what we recognize that they started to program some things into us that are still residual today. And so those ancient ancestors were hunter-gatherers. And when was the best time to be a hunter and gatherer in a 24-hour period? The daytime was the best time. And so light became good, helpful, a place where fear did not have to be the predominant operating factor. Given that same 24-hour period for people who are hunter-gatherers and not very good predators and oftentimes were prey, what was the most fearful time for them? Nighttime. And so in our primal brain, we have this primal instinct that light is good, daytime is good, and nighttime or darkness is bad. We'll talk more about how that plays into implicit bias a little bit later. But that particular point is an important one to recognize because it served a purpose for our ancestors. So they knew when things would be safe and then when they had to be on their guard. So their primal brain was looking at danger as it made decisions. Fortunately for us, we have grown, we've developed, we've adapted to our context, we've evolved, and we have this thing called the prefrontal cortex,